Another individual you have covered is José Ignacio Hernández. Could you please talk about him? And I found one statement particularly relevant. Quote, his lucrative relationships with foreign corporations scheming to exploit Venezuela's wealth lift the mask on the real forces behind Guaidó's regime change efforts and their ulterior profit-driven agenda. So who is José Ignacio Hernández and who are the real forces behind these regime change efforts?
José Ignacio Hernández is actually kind of a protege of Ricardo Hausmann. He works under Ricardo Hausmann at Harvard's Growth Lab and is very close to him. Someone who I imagine looks up to Ricardo Hausmann a lot. Ricardo Hausmann's older, but up until June of this year, José Ignacio Hernández served as Juan Guaidó's top legal representative in the United States, essentially Juan Guaidó's attorney general, according to the U.S. government, which recognizes the legitimacy of the Guaidó administration. And I first learned about him last summer in conversations I was having with members of Venezuela's opposition who aren't a part of Voluntad Popular, the party which is led by Leopoldo Lopez, a major right-wing figure in Venezuela, and that's the party of Juan Guaidó. That's the party which is really most closely tied to the United States currently and has led this regime change operation and was instrumental in a lot of the violent protests we saw over recent years in Venezuela known as guarimbas. Those are largely directed by Leopoldo Lopez and then this youth that they have in the streets such as Juan Guaidó. And these members of the opposition that I was speaking with are closer to more independent opposition parties that don't answer directly to the United States. For example, the candidate of Henri Falcón, he actually ran against Nicolas Maduro in 2018, despite the fact that USA Today actually reported the U.S. threatened to sanction him for participating in the election, because if you remember, that was when the opposition was boycotting the election in order to invalidate any idea that Venezuela was a democratic state. The U.S. had essentially demanded parties such as Popular Will, Guaidó's party, don't participate in the election whatsoever, because if they don't participate, then Venezuela can't claim to have a healthy democracy where multiple parties are participating. So Henri Falcón ran. This is the Progressive Advance Party. And some of the people close to him started to explain to me that this character, José Ignacio Hernández, really had played an understated role in a really major case in the United States, which is now led to, any day now we could learn that Citgo Petroleum, Venezuela's largest international asset, which is a gas station in the United States. It's somewhere where people in the U.S. go to fill up their gas tank and their cars, but it's actually a subsidiary of Petróleos de Venezuela, the state-owned oil company in Venezuela. Up until last year, when Trump administration sanctions made this impossible, Venezuela would ship its oil to the United States. It was refined in Citgo refineries and then pumped out at Citgo gas stations all over the country. But now Citgo itself could actually be liquidated in order to pay back several corporations which claim to have debt owed to them by the Venezuelan government. And you may remember last summer, one of these corporations, Crystalex, made headlines because it won a legal battle in the United States. It's a Canadian mining company which claimed that due to the fact that the Venezuelan government expropriated a mine it had in Venezuela, it was owed somewhere around $1.2 billion by the Venezuelan government because of this action of expropriating the mine, nationalizing the mine. And a U.S. court ruled last year that debt was valid, that the Venezuelan government indeed owed $1.2 billion to this Canadian mining firm. In the eyes of that U.S. court, the government responsible for making that payment is the Guaidó administration. And where do they have their money? How do they have any money in the United States? It's through the frozen assets belonging to the Venezuelan government in the United States, which at the initiation of this coup, the U.S. essentially stole from Venezuela and has frozen and now turned over to the Guaidó administration. And among those accounts, among those assets frozen, the most valuable one is Citgo. And so Crystalex needed to prove that it was fair to go after the assets and the money stored in these Citgo accounts, a private U.S. company. They needed to prove that it was valid to go after that money of a private U.S. company in order to win back money owed by the Venezuelan government by proving this legal argument known as inter alia, that basically Citgo, even though it was a private U.S. corporation, was in fact an alter ego or equal to the Venezuelan government. And before the Guaidó administration took over in the eyes of the U.S. courts, there was a separation between the powers of the Venezuelan government and Citgo. The Venezuelan government would only directly appoint the board of PDVSA. PDVSA would then appoint the board of PDVSA Holding, which then would appoint the board of Citgo Holding, which then appointed the board of Citgo. So there was separation in order to maintain Citgo's independence as a private U.S. corporation. That changed immediately after the recognition of Juan Guaidó, when under Guaidó, the National Assembly directly appointed the boards of PDVSA, PDVSA Holding, Citgo Holding, and Citgo Petroleum. So they just shattered that separation of powers which had previously existed and which had protected Citgo from this legal argument, or from proving the legal argument that Citgo was an alter ego of the Venezuelan state. Why was that allowed to happen under the watch of Juan Guaidó? Well, it turns out that José Ignacio Hernández, Guaidó's top legal representative in the United States, wasn't simply working on behalf of the Venezuelan people. Instead, before he was appointed to the Guaidó administration, he was actually a witness in the Crystalex case who testified on behalf not of the Venezuelan government, not on behalf of PDVSA or the Venezuelan side of the issue. He testified on behalf of Crystalex. And what did he testify about? He testified in order to support the legal argument that Citgo was an alter ego of the Venezuelan state. So what that means is then he as Guaidó's top legal representative in the United States, took direct action, allowed the Venezuelan government in the eyes of the United States to place a hand directly into a private U.S. corporation, Citgo Petroleum, and therefore prove Crystalex's legal argument against Citgo. And the opposition figures I spoke with said they believed Citgo had a stronger case up until the Guaidó government took this action, but also that it was José Ignacio Hernández's responsibility as the legal representative of Venezuela to stop something such as the direct appointment of the Citgo board, because he should have known that it would completely jeopardize Citgo, again, Venezuela's largest international asset. And it turns out that Crystalex is not the only private corporation José Ignacio Hernández has worked on behalf of. He also received $163,000 from a company called Owens, Illinois. It's a glass company based in Ohio, which also sued the Venezuelan government, claiming that it was owed debt, and also is looking for a stake in Citgo in order to get paid. Again, José Ignacio Hernández provided testimony to this corporation to prove its legal argument that Citgo was an alter ego of the Venezuelan state. So that's two corporations already that he's worked on behalf of in order to destroy and sell Venezuela's most prized possession, Citgo Petroleum. And it really speaks to the interest, the corporate forces that these figures represent, while they're actually claiming to represent the interests of the Venezuelan people. The last point that I'll make on the Citgo case is that in order to pay these companies, Crystalex and Owens, Illinois, what happens is the court doesn't just transfer the Citgo accounts to these corporations. What they actually do is sell it in a fire sale to other oil industry giants. So they'll say, okay, Citgo's assets are up for auction. Who wants to buy it? And corporations such as British Petroleum or Shell Gasoline or ExxonMobil can come in and say, we want to expand our share of the oil market, and so we'll pay for whatever parts of Citgo we want. We'll take that over. And then the court uses that money in order to pay back Crystalex and Owens, Illinois. That's important to understand because Carlos Vecchio, the ambassador representing Guaidó's administration in the United States, is actually simply just a lackey working on behalf of ExxonMobil. This is something else that I covered extensively at the Grayzone with my colleague from Venezuela with the publication Misión Verdad, my friend Diego Sequeira. Last year, we put together a biography looking at the record of Carlos Vecchio and found that he was actually a top attorney for ExxonMobil for years in Venezuela, leading the corporation's legal fight against the Venezuelan government until it was kicked out of the country in 2007. And so Exxon is now on the short list of companies that will purchase Citgo in order to pay back Crystalex and Owens, Illinois. So the employer, the former employer of one Guaidó official, Carlos Vecchio and ExxonMobil, will benefit from this scheme run by José Ignacio Hernández, who with that money will then pay back his friends in Crystalex and Owens, Illinois, corporations which he worked hand in glove with in order to fight the Venezuelan government and fight the Venezuelan people. And so that's why this story really reveals the true forces behind this Guaidó shadow administration. They do not represent the interests of the Venezuelan people. They represent the interests, the same tired interests of foreign capital and industry, which have been trying to undermine the Venezuelan revolution since 1998.